Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. It's a great pleasure to be welcoming someone like Ameena Hussein. She is one of the foremost English fiction writers from Sri Lanka, and she wears two hats. She also, along with her husband, has a publishing concern called Pereira and Hussein, if I'm correct. So she's not just an author whose book was shortlisted for the Man Prize, but also a publisher. And I hope during our conversation that we will talk a little about the business of publishing, which is non-existent in Pakistan. Bear with me if you would, particularly you, Ameena. Shamsuddin Abdullah Muhammad Ibn Abdullah Ibn Muhammad bin Ibrahim Ibn Muhammad Ibn Yusuf al-Lawati al-Tanji, a man you and I know as Ibn Battuta. He was a scholar, theologian, adventurer, warrior, sailor, swimmer, traveler, explorer, pilgrim, botanist, politician, poet, journalist, historian, geographer, jurist, ascetic, devotee, and most importantly, pleasure seeker. It's quite a mouthful. Ameena, I read through your book, and I have to tell you that I started it with a little bit of trepidation because I'm not really fond of the travelogue kind of thing, sort of looking or exploring or whatever. But I thought it was a magnificent narrative because Ibn Battuta is just a character. He is not the book at all. The book is you. It's your voice. Because through all the places that you believe and have heard and have verified, the places that Ibn Battuta visited, you're also tracing the history of your own family. You're also looking at yourself as a woman and also as a Muslim. So that is what fascinated me. But at the very beginning, you say, this book is a personal journey. And I want you to talk about that a little bit.
Thank you, Nivi. Thank you, Nivi. And thank you, everyone, for coming to listen to me. And I'm just so delighted to be here at the LLF. It's an absolute pleasure to have come from Sri Lanka to attend this festival and meet like-minded people. When the decision to put personal journey was an afterthought, when I began the book, when I began the research actually, it was not going to be a personal journey. It was on a whim, actually. The entire project started on a whim. I had attended a Silk Routes conference in the Maldives, and we were talking, it was people from the SAARC region, and the one common thread that came up was this name, Ibn Battuta. And I was astonished because actually being from a country, an island like Sri Lanka, we're quite insular. So we think we are the be-all and end-all of everything. And I knew that Ibn Battuta had visited Sri Lanka, but actually as a kid, that's all we are taught. We are not taught actually the scope of his travel. So I decided to come back and I started doing some reading, and I had been fascinated in any case. My parents would talk a lot about this Moroccan traveler who came. And then, as I say at the beginning of the book, it all started, I own a coconut and cashew farm in the northwest of the country on the coast, and my husband comes back from a trip to town and says, I have a surprise for you. And he shows me a photograph on his camera, and it says, Ibn Battuta Street. I honestly had a shiver going down my spine.
That photograph is in the book.
I thought actually a dilapidated, not at all a complimentary photograph to Ibn Battuta, but I thought he's remembered. This man is remembered, a 14th century traveler. And then I began to think, if he's remembered in Putlam, maybe I should read his entire journey in the country and map out the route and try to, everything started on a whim or a thought, like maybe it'll be fun. I'm a bit of a vagrant wanderer, kind of person. Give me a car and I will hop on it and I'll go anywhere. And then I asked my husband, who is as crazy as I am, I said, will you drive me to all these places? And he's a vagabond as well, so he said, yeah, sure, let's go on a trip. And so it actually started like that. But when I went, I discovered something deeper. As I say in my epilogue, Sri Lanka currently also is going through a fairly turbulent time with its minorities.
Like Pakistan.
Possibly. I can see a lot of relationships and similarities. And because I belong to a minority community, the Muslims of Sri Lanka, we are at 10%, I began to actually understand and discover more my place in this country. Because there are times when you think you're unwanted and you, like, what are you doing here? No, the minorities seem to be, sidelined, sometimes threatened, and felt very unwelcome, even though our minorities have lived there. I mean, the Muslims have lived there for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years. Christians have been there for like 600 years. And still, it's a negotiation. But I will say the blame doesn't always lie with the majority. Muslims also of Sri Lanka have their part to play. And it's revealed in some parts in the book, not obviously, but in some parts. And so when I finished the travel, I decided, what have I got actually? I've got so many pieces. Battuta is just the name is remembered. People don't know much about him in Sri Lanka. Even the Muslims, it was hilarious because some said he came from Russia, others said he came from
there
India.
are some who asserted that he was a Russian.
Yeah, they said he landed in Gaul, he landed in Colombo, everywhere but Puttalam, where he actually landed. So they knew bits and pieces. And then I thought, I have to bring in the history of the country as well, because actually Sri Lankans know very little about their medieval history, because it's not documented so much. So that began, history, personal memoir, Ibn Battuta's travels, and then I thought the only way I can give the reader do the reader justice is to warn them, which is why I put personal journey.
Thank you. That really elucidates for us how this personal journey came about. Now, you're trained as a sociologist.
I am.
And you take on something as massive as the travels of Ibn Battuta, which is an enormous historical exercise. So there must have been problems that immediately arose. One that I can foresee immediately is that the names of places have changed. And you fall back very often and rather irreverently on your very vivid imagination. So it's not really a methodological approach that you take, but more a stylistic one. Would I be correct if I said that it was more stylistic? Because you do take liberties and there are detours.
So that's the fun of doing a book like this is, I mean, you have history, but then if the history is not that well documented in the country, then you have to rely on oral narrative. If the oral narrative is all over the place, then you have to rely on a hunch. And so very often, so part of it was in discovering unexpected things. And through that, I discovered the rich history of the Sri Lankan Muslim community. And so some people might read this and say, actually, so where is Battuta in all this? But to be frank, Battuta is everywhere, because Battuta came in the 14th century. The first documentation of Muslims being in the country is a 9th century gravestone. And so, at least from the 9th century, people were dying here. Muslims were dying in Sri Lanka because there was a gravestone. And you have a lot of writings from the Middle East, all written in Arabic. And because the world is so English-centric. It was only translated, many of it not translated, and what was translated, only translated like in maybe the 17th and
Yeah.
18th centuries. So, yes, I had a lot
good
of guesswork.
5 to 6 centuries after the Rihala, which is what Ibn Battuta's journals are called, were written. So
Yes.
there's a tremendous gap in between the time that he wrote, and much of it is now being contested because
So I was going to talk about that because when you said I'd taken a lot of creative liberties, well, I'm following the Battutian tradition because he too took a lot of creative
Yes,
liberties.
he did.
And much to the extent that today people wonder, did he actually go to China? I mean, perhaps he cribbed all this from some other traveler who went and
So it seems. It seems that Ibn Battuta never made it to China, but he took all this material that was written by other travelers and put it under his name. So there's a lot of contestation about what is true and what is fiction.
And also because the initial part of his travel through Turkey and the Caucasus and India and Sri Lanka are very detailed.
That's true.
And then you come to, and maybe Java also to some extent, but actually China is like, you don't get much of it. He just says, I don't like this country. I don't like the food, because he was a very strict Muslim who would not eat non-halal. And you have accounts where he's on a boat and he's very disapproving of the fishermen who
That's right.
are happily catching the birds and eating them, maybe roasting them without doing the qurban. And he refused to eat it. And in one case, he benefited from it when he was returning from China, and there was a princess of the steppes who invited him for a meal, and he refused to go because he wasn't sure how the food was prepared. So she summons him to say why he rejected her royal invitation. And when she hears his reasons, she then provides him with enough of food that he can cook, like jars of grain and butter, clarified butter and
Millet and so
yeah,
on, yes.
and all that, so that he can cook his own food and eat well, which I thought was very understanding of,
Very
royal
generous,
member.
I would
Yes,
say.
exactly.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to read 3 lines from Ameena's book, which really caught my attention. She writes, and I'm quoting, "Purple pedal pushers, a blue calico shirt, and pink rubber sandals were perhaps not the ideal clothing to wear when visiting the Grand Mosque of Puttalam, but it all happened very fast. If you ever tried to get into a mosque dressed like that here in Pakistan, I don't think you'd be let in." Really. Does such a possibility exist in Sri Lanka? That you can be dressed in any manner and yet enter a mosque being a woman?
So I'll tell you the backstory to how that happened. So I went unexpectedly to town, and I thought, okay, let me see if I can get access to the mosque, if they know anything. But because I was dressed like this, I stayed discreetly in the car and sent my deputy, my husband, into the mosque. It was vital I traveled with him because I had to enter so many mosques. And mosques in Sri Lanka are a fearsome space for women. So I sent Sam
They are
in.
that here too. So
But I
that's
was
something
very
else.
impressed. I went to the Wazir Shah Mosque, and there's a
Yes.
shrine, and I entered the shrine with trepidation, expecting at any minute to be shooed away, which was my general
No,
experience
no.
in Sri Lanka. And they allowed me in. I said a little prayer. I came out, and for me, that's a marked difference because in Sri Lanka, women are never allowed into the shrine, but a man, whether he's Muslim or not, can enter the shrine. So it is very much a male space in Sri Lanka. So to get back to the story, he tried to take photographs, and some guard there shooed him away and said, "You have to get permission from the trustees of the mosque." And who were the trustees? Luckily for us, our fertilizer dealers who were right in front. And we had been buying fertilizers for them for the past 10 years at that time. And so I bounced in there because just last week I had had a major conversation about my orange and lime trees and fertilizers and which one. And anyway, we go there. We say we want to enter the mosque to take photographs. And they are friendly, but then they start doing other business, writing receipts and like politely ignoring that request. Made it again. And then because I had studied so much about Ibn Battuta, my family knew everything about him, my mother, father, my husband. Never was a mealtime able to be had without Ibn Battuta being mentioned. That my mother said, if that man was alive, I thought you might be having an affair with him, which in a way I was, an intellectual affair. And then what happened was, my husband decided then that we should act like Ibn Battuta, and he began to name drop. All I had to do was just nod sagely. So he pointed to me and asked the fertilizer dealer, "Do you know who this is?" And the fertilizer dealer looks at me, purple pedal pushers, blue Gap shirt, and he looks very suspiciously. And then Sam starts reciting my lineage. And, she's the granddaughter of so-and-so, and she's the great-granddaughter of so-and-so. And with each lineage, they were suitably impressed. And then they look at me after Sam says something, they look at me and I say, that's all I had to do.
Very regally.
And that opened the doors. So then they sent a guide with us, which then we were taken right up to see the clock tower and told stories. And every time someone in the mosque, a bearded man with a skull cap, looked very disapprovingly at me, I didn't even have a scarf. And then he would just say, great-granddaughter of so-and-so and granddaughter of so-and-so. And it was like a magic door. So then I learned to travel like Ibn Battuta within Sri Lanka. I learned to, it's horrible for me to say this, and in Sri Lanka, which is a far more egalitarian society, at least one person came and told me, weren't you boasting? So I said, if it sounds like boasting, then yes, you may take it as boasting. But to me, it was the way I could enter sacred spaces which were not easy to enter. And so this became a password. Within 5 seconds of me entering a mosque, one of us would drop, a line about, a few names of who we were. And because my extended family is still very much, they're mosque trustees of important mosques, and there's always a connection. There's a mosque network all over the island, like perhaps maybe even in Pakistan. It then got me entry, but I still couldn't get into the shrine space, so my emissary had to go in and take all the photographs, which you see.
Yes, they're all there. Now, what struck me, actually, and I do not mean to be disrespectful in any way, I thought when you gave a byline, Chasing Tall Tales and Mystics, that should have been the title of the book rather than a byline. Because Ibn Battuta in Sri Lanka, really, as I said earlier, he's just a character, and it's like the nail that you hang the whole tale on, because the kind of stories that you tell, they are absolutely mind-boggling. For example, when you went looking for Adam and Eve's graves, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I'm sure our audience would love to hear about it.
So we had heard a tale. There is a Bible of the Sri Lankan traveler, which was published in the 1950s. It's called The Handbook of the Ceylon Traveler. And when my husband and I returned from living in Europe in 2003, that was one of the first books we bought because we were looking for some land to buy. And we thought when we go on our jaunts, we'll do some sightseeing off the beaten track. And I came across this mention of Adam and Eve. The graves of Adam and Eve are found in Manna. Now, at that time, you must remember, we were going through our 26-year war. So manna was out of bounds. But when we landed in Sri Lanka, there was a ceasefire and manna was opened up. So we decided to take our chance and look for those graves, and with a couple of friends, we went, and it was a very strange experience because it's in the middle of the war zone. So you go on a rutted road, a really bad road. It's normally a journey that would be 5 hours from Colombo. I think it took us like about 7 or 8 hours. And then you pass the Sri Lankan army checkpoint. When you pass the Sri Lankan army checkpoint, they then say there's another checkpoint further up, and you have to, and when we asked them what's that checkpoint, they said that's the LTTE checkpoint, the Tamil Tiger checkpoint. Now we got really frightened because we didn't expect that. We thought, oh, ceasefire. We went like idiots. Ceasefire, everything's hunky-dory. We go to the Sri Lankan army checkpoint. I hope I'm not construed as being disparaging to my country and the forces, but manned by Sinhalese who are essentially very, very laid back. So they're leaning against a doorpost, cheerful smiles, greeted us really nicely.
It all sounds very familiar.
And waved us on. And then we come to the LTT checkpoint, which is run like a military camp. So we are asked to get down, and we were staying one night in Mannar. They searched our bags, found a bottle of prohibited spirits, and said, and it was not even full, it was quarter, and said, we're going to confiscate it. We'll give it to you when you return. So my friends, who are non-Muslims, were desperate. They could not imagine one night without, their bottle. And they said, no, please give it to us. We will not drink. You can measure it. We will not drink when we are there, right? And you can check it on our return. I think they were so convincing that the LTT gave it back. But we had to fill out forms in triplicates. There were no carbon copies because carbon copies were not allowed in the war zones. And it took a laborious amount of time, and then they waved us on. So then, okay, heave a sigh of relief, and you get to Mannar. So I really don't know what we were thinking when we went. There were no places to eat. You had to buy your food, and we kept our food on the back of our truck and ate standing. The place that we stayed in was so dismal. You had to shower with your eyes closed because you didn't want to see what actually was around that area. And then the next day, we decided to go looking. Now, Mannar is a 100% Tamil-speaking area. And I'm the only one who knew really, really bad Tamil. It's a miracle anyone can understand me when I speak. And so we had this one person who barely knew a language, and now we had to navigate and go to all these spaces. My mistake in asking for Adam and Eve was using the English pronunciation.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve. And I got
Instead
nowhere.
of the Arabic.
Yes. And then I go, and now my friends are tired of me. They are like, get over it. We want to go and see the pier. We want to go and do other side baobab trees. And you're just obsessed with this. You're wasting our time. I said, give me one more chance. And we went to a small, tiny Hindu kovil. And I jumped in there, and I asked the Pusari, I said, do you know anything about Adam and Hawa? And his face lit up. And he said, yes. And he gave us directions. But at every point, his directions got us on a road, but we had many turns. So at every point I asked for Adam and Hawa. Then I get to a kind of a sandy beach, and there's a tiny doll-like structure. The doorway is so low you have to bend to get in. It was unmanned, and when we go in there, typically in Sri Lankan Muslim shrines, to denote a very a saint or a highly spiritually evolved person, the grave is like 10 feet long.
Yes.
And so there were these two 10-foot-long graves on a sea beach sand, and it was very moving. Honestly, for all of us, it was very moving to be there. You knew that it had survived through so many ravages of war. And luckily for us, a family came in with a baby, which they blessed by placing on the baby's
on the grave.
face on each of the headstones. And then they told us the story of how these came up to be Adam and Eve, that these bodies were found floating in a wooden coffin in the sea. When the non-Muslim fishermen went out to sea and tried to retrieve it because they thought it was full of some maybe ship treasure, the box bobbed away from them. And when they returned, the Muslim contingent was going, the fishing fleet. They said, "Oh, there's a box out there. Try to retrieve it."
And the box came to them.
The box came to them, and then when they brought it ashore, they had these two bodies, and there was a little, I mean, according to them, there was a no, they didn't say there was a note. They buried the graves by the seashore, and then the lead fisherman had a dream. The book is peppered with dreams. Dreams have a way. I mean, I listened to Damon Galgut in the session before, and he in The Promise, he talks about how there's a character who watches people's dreams, and in a way, everybody is finding old Muslim shrines through dreams, because they've been lost, and then they have a dream, and then they go in search of it. So the lead fisherman had a dream saying, "We do not like this place you have buried us in. We are Adam and Eve, and fishermen come and drink and carouse," and gave instructions as to where they should be buried, and then they found their resting place. Much later, so Leonard Woolf also in his diaries talk about it as Adam and Eve's graves. After I published the book, people started taking this book and going about the island looking for all these places. And then some mosques were outraged that they were called Adam and Eve's graves. They were like, "What rubbish." And then they actually concocted another name. So many people have written to me saying, "You know, what you've said is wrong, but it's post-publication that the change has happened." The other thing is history is always being rewritten in our part of the world, and if you don't have much documentation. I'm glad in a way that this book was written, because now things are in print. That's one of the best things about having books published, is you can say safely that in this year it was so. When Leonard Woolf was here, it was so. When Ceylon Traveller was published, it was so. But now if you want to change it, that's fine. But
Now,
this is in
now
print.
you're able to refer to milestones.
Yes.
And say, well, this is pre that particular period and this is post that particular period. Talking about Adam and Eve, I think what I found really fascinating is not just this particular story. And as I said earlier, because she's talking about chasing tall tales, she's chasing them all over the place. And I'm amazed not only at her energy, but I'm amazed at her husband, who supported her throughout all these vagabond activities. Yes, I think he deserves a clap, certainly.
He's seated in the audience, but I'm not going to embarrass him further by pointing him out.
No. We must have Sam stand up.
No.
Sam. There you are. Wonderful man that you are. Thank you very much for taking our friend all over Sri Lanka, trying to look for the graves of Adam and Eve. And also, what I found fascinating was this story about how when Allah banished Adam and Eve from Eden, that Adam actually came and landed in Sri Lanka, and Eve landed in Jeddah. And I started wondering, I said, oh, good heavens, then how did we come about? I mean, if they were so far away from each other. Apparently, the story doesn't end there, because Adam then decided to go for Hajj. And when he went to Mecca, he caught up with Eve there, and then together the two of them set up this wonderful sanctuary that you and I go to for Hajj. So I think stories like these are immensely entertaining. They may not be true, they may be foundational myths. You can call them anything you like. But when I was thinking of talking about these things, it was with a little bit of concern, like the people at the mosque who became upset with you about Adam and Eve's graves. I thought there may be someone in the audience who takes umbrage at the fact that one talks about actual graves of Adam and Eve. However, I'm pretty safe right now. Let me digress a little. Ameena is an incredible writer. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind about that, nor will there be in yours when you read her book. This is not the only kind of narrative that she has written. What I found fascinating was an earlier book called 15, which is really based on the raw material that she found when she was doing her sociology program. Would you like to talk to us about 15 a little bit?
So I was not someone who, when I come across many young people today who tell me they want to be a writer. The era I grew up in, there was no such thing as being a writer, not for a Sri Lankan woman, maybe, not for a Sri Lankan Muslim woman. And so that did not enter my mind at all. And when I went off to university and I did a degree in sociology, I did qualitative sociology. And so I had to do a lot of research. I was based in Los Angeles. And but I was still very hung up about our region, the South Asian region. It was in Los Angeles first that I began reading South Asian writers and actually moving away from Western writers for about a good 10, 15 years. I've now come back to them, but I was just delighting in reading about things that were familiar from our part of the world that didn't need much explaining. I did my research for my master's thesis on immigrant South Asian Muslim women in the Los Angeles area. And the thing is that when you are studying for master's, PhD, your writing has to be very, very dispassionate. And so actually I had to take, and these women just poured their hearts out to me. I was astonished that they were willing to share so much of what they had gone through.
And such intimate details.
And in so much detail. And so I began to keep a separate notebook with writing all their stories. And then the research came about written in very academic terms. And luckily I was awarded my degree. Then what happened was I wondered what to do with it, and I actually started making stories out of what these women had said.
All the narratives.
And I met a friend who has passed away now in New York, a Sri Lankan. And when you are in your 20s, you say, oh, I don't want to be political. Sri Lanka's going through a war. What do I know? Yeah. I'm actually not interested in it. And he told me all writers are political, whether you like it or not.
Well, all art is political.
And I realized, yes. So, and I realized as writing that even if you're writing about women, even if you're writing about a wedding, even a perfectly innocuous way, the way we see it, the way we present it, the way we interpret it, is also a political statement that you're making. So when 15 came out, I was a bit scared because it's quite in your face. I was youngish at that time. So we timed the publication so that it would come out as soon as I got married and I left the country. And then, so all the waves that were created, like who is this Ameena Hussein? Nobody knew me at that time because I was in the NGO world and working in sociology and human rights for 10 years. So who is this woman and how dare she write this? My language was brazen and forthright. And my poor parents had to suffer the brunt of it. And my father just said, well, I'm not surprised at anything that she does. She has given us grief all her years.
Well, you can think of Ameena as Asmat Chughtai in English. I can vouch for that. If you were to read the stories titled 15. I've just been told that we have some time now for question and answer, but before we get to that, there's a passage that I want to read to you, because Ameena has been talking about dreams. And the kind of dreams that Ameena has are not erotic, I'm sorry, Sam. They are to do with food. And they are to do with food in as much as Ibn Battuta loved food. He was a gourmet also. So allow me to read a little bit, and then we'll go on to the question answer. She writes, I dreamt that we partook of Ibn Battuta's banquet feast. Latakian bread, olives, vinegar and capers, cheese, millet, curdled mare's milk soup with small pieces of meat. This was followed by main dishes of ostrich, gazelle, and wild asses from Yemen, accompanied by fish wrapped in aromatic leaves and broiled, served with rice cooked in butter from Tabriz. For dessert, we had ruby-colored Murcian pomegranates and fig and almonds from Alaka. We washed it all down with buza, the white fermented millet drink better known as beer, which Ibn Battuta found lawful to drink, although he did not much care for its bitter taste. A feast fit for Ibn Battuta, but for me, only in my dreams. And I think it would serve our purpose well. I had wanted very much to talk about Sri Padam, where the footprint of Adam is supposed to be, but alas, we shall have to wait for another session. I think that this forms a very good closing note on what Ameena has to say. My entire Ibn Battuta journey in Lanka covered over 1,200 kilometers, stretched out over a year in fits and starts. And just for that, I think, the kind of work that went into it. If I wanted to clarify a point, I went back and even tried out alternative routes. I'd like to think, as Tim McIntosh Smith said, travel was an amalgamation of interruptions. I imagine that even after the publication of this book, I will be traveling on other possible Ibn Battuta routes, and hope it will bring more encounters that will make my experience of my country richer and deeper. To you, Ameena, we say, bon voyage.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we open the house now to any questions that you have. I'm sure Ameena would be happy to answer them. Do we have a microphone that we can pass around?
Do we have a hand raised?
Anyone? They're spellbound by you, Ameena.
I hope so.
No, honestly,
I hope so.
They can't think of any questions to ask, but there is one up front here.
It's not a question, it's a statement. This requires a conversation. And this book requires a conversation.
Absolutely.
An exchange of ideas, a furthering of and deepening of the journey. It's a fascinating story. I wish there was more time.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
I
much.
wish so too. Anyone else? Well, I'd like to finish on what I think is a very important note, which is that of hope. Ameena is a cancer survivor. She has battled it. She has made it public. She has spoken about it. And she has managed to push it back as far as is possible. This is a very brave woman, not only in her personal life, but also in what she writes and what she believes in. Because she says quite clearly in one place, I forget where, she says, I want to write about women. Is that so?
Women interest me. They're far more interesting than men.
Hooray for that. That's a comment we wanted to hear. Can we have the microphone there, please?
Sorry, everybody. I think if it wasn't for the women, this world would be black and white.
Thank you.
They are the color.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Ameena. I just want to say, since I have the mic, that you're an amazing writer, and that was an amazing session. And I don't actually have a question because I feel like I just need to go and read the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You'll have been a wonderful audience. The book is available at Readings Bookshop. And there's my novel, The Moon in the Water, as well, that's available.
That's the
Sadly,
first
I
novel.
didn't bring 15.
Oh, I'm so very sorry, but you're a publisher, and we never got to talking about your publishing business, but I hope very much that you will tie up with someone here and send us all your books.
Actually, there is a publishing session tomorrow, and Sam Pereira, who is my husband and partner, will be talking about publishing in Sri Lanka, if you want to catch it.
Well, I would encourage everyone sitting in this hall to go buy this book, because it will really change your perception of what travel books are all about and what history is all about. Thank you very much, Ameena, for a wonderful session.
Thank you, Navid. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you for being so attentive. Bahut shukriya.